We are going to be recording this session so that we can reflect back on it and critique ourselves and try to improve on what we've done today. I guess a couple quick notes while we're just letting people settle in. And I think Courtney, Paul, Amanda, this is kind of what we normally kick off with. Like, please engage with us. Like, you can come off mute. Please type in the chat. We're hoping that this is an interactive session, that you can get your questions answered and that we can get some dialogue going. We're up to 40 people in the room, which is super exciting. Courtney, Paul, we good? Want to get rolling? Okay. So let me start sharing my screen, and Courtney, take it away, my friend.
All right, welcome everyone. It's just good to see everybody. Glad to be in the building with you all, as my grandmother would say, one more time. And glad to see, when I see the numbers, one of the things that's important to me is I'm beginning to see a group of people who are fully committed to being able to expand their toolkit about how they're able to show up for kids. Because at the core of this, it's how do we show up for kids in a way as now, so that when they become adults, they can show up for others in an even better way, right? And so thank you all for coming. Recognizing like this is the Completing Trauma Responsive School implementation, which is just TRS-IA and calculating disproportionality data session. Of course, you heard it's going to be myself, Courtney Tucker. You're going to see my partner, Paul Hyry-Dermott, and you'll also be hearing the voice of John Crocker. And so thank you all for coming. A little bit about this initiative. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for CCWT, which is the Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma, which is really invested in creating resources that help organizations in Massachusetts deliver trauma-informed, culturally responsive information, tools, and training for kids. They're like, look, how do we make sure, recognizing, especially in the last couple of years, how many of our kids are living from a place of trauma, right? And they want to say, how do we serve them in a way that builds resilience versus tearing them down? So the next thing is just knowing that, right? And Mass, John, I'm getting your organization wrong. MASMH and Rennie Center are partners in this. We work together on the initiative called Thriving Minds. And what you'll see is that we have a series of professional developments, a series of peer learning opportunities that we all come together because, again, it goes back to this point. How do we create thriving minds? Because if we can create thriving minds, we can create an environment that can cultivate thriving adults. Right? We don't want people to live in a place where they're constantly surviving and in crisis. Again, thank you to all the partners. And where we're going to go now is I just want to start off with this opening activity. We want to know who's in the room. I want to know, who am I talking to? Am I just being a talking head? What district are you in? What's your role? And then, one word that describes what you hope to gain today. We're just going to do one word. So who are you? What's your role? Where are you? And what do you hope to gain today? Let's throw that in the chat so we can see, who are you? What's your role? Where are you? And one role that describes what you want to gain. Hey, Principal Westdale, thank you for being our first person. Thank you. Thank you. We got Chicopee Public Schools. Okay. We got some Bridgewater, therapeutic learning coordinator. We got clinical coordinating. Hi, everybody. Y'all from all over. We got psychologists. We got tutors. We got clinical specialists, counselors. Hey. Hi, everybody. Adjustment counselors. Hi, adjustment counselors. Someone said, I want to add to my toolbox. That's her thing. She says, addition is her word. I am here to add to what I'm able to do, right? So one of the things, thank you all for continuing to share in the chat, and we're going to keep it rolling because we have a full agenda for you all today, is you perfectly get why we're here. One of the things I want to focus on is we know our why, right? And when we think about this too, we're here because we want to know how to better serve our students. particularly our students who are coming to us having experienced life already that hasn't always felt good to them. So how do we embrace a trauma-informed lens in the work that we do? That's why we're here, right? So then our what is like, what do we want to achieve? Right? What is our hope? We know why we're here. What do we want to achieve? And then how do we do the work? The last time we met, we talked about this. What do we want to achieve? Right? And so on the next slide, you'll see what do we want to achieve? We want to shift. We want there to be a fundamental shift from being reactive when kids present and they show up and they've experienced trauma. And we want to get to a place that we can say, not only are we trauma informed, we're healing centered. We want to get to a place that you can say, look, on the spectrum, initially, kids showed up, people showed up, and the environment could actually have been a duplication. How they were treated in the environment could duplicate trauma-related experiences. We want to shift that. We want to get to a place where, like we're not re-traumatizing our kids. We're also recognizing that some kids, based on their orientation, based on their intersectional identities, are coming with us having experienced something that is generational trauma, right? And so how do we hold that? Recognizing that we're not just getting responses, we're not just getting things from what they've experienced in life, we're getting what generations have experienced, right? We want to realize trauma is widespread. It's not something that's one off and one person has it and the other doesn't. We want to recognize the effects and we want to respond appropriately, right? That's what trauma informed is. But not just that, we want to be healing centered because we can be trauma informed, we can be working right, but we can't be ushering in healing. We're like, I want to help you heal, right? Helping heal. That's when we say, you know what? We're offering opportunities for collaboration. We're valuing the relationship, right? You'll hear John say the relationship is important, right? And we're having a growth mindset. We don't believe that everyone has to stay the same. We constantly believe that you are where you are because of what has happened to you. And with the right amount of experiences and exposure, you don't have to become that, right? So in the next slide, you'll see, we're shifting, we're believing that the what is that behavior? You're trying to tell me something, right? That shift is happening from what's wrong with you. Like, why can't you act right? We're going to what happened to you, right? Recognize your behavior is communicating a need, it's communicating trauma, it's communicating, a lot. Your behavior is telling a story. And then we want to extend it to what can I do to help you? We recognize that trauma, what is the trauma directly impacts the brain, right? You see the images. When I'm stressed, when I'm depressed, when I'm stuck in flight, right, freeze, or fawn, you see how much access I have to the upper part of my brain, which is my reason and reflecting? Hardly any. And yet you're coming to institutions where we reside in school. So it's so important that I recognize that my goal of educating adults, of creating healthy adults, will only be achieved if I can help you understand what you're trying to tell me through your behavior. And our what also includes Bruce Perry has some quotes that I just want to read to you that he says, you all heard me say it's in the relationship. We recognize trauma. We can change the outcomes of somebody's life by being that positive adult. Bruce Perry says, fire can warm or consume. Water can quench or drown. Wind can caress or cut. And so it is with human relationships. We recognize that we both create and destroy, nurture and terrorize, traumatize and heal. You all are here because you recognize that if we can think about how we're in relationship with our kids, with our teachers, with each other, and even with the community, that we can heal. And that is what will help us implement the environments we want, right? And he also says the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely they are to recover from the trauma. So if you want to be trauma informed and we want to have people heal, we have to be attuned to how are we in relationship? And even how are we helping individuals who've experienced trauma be in a better relationship with themselves, right? How do we help them be in better relationship with themselves? Again, let's love each other. John's going to talk about how do we do this. And again, we talked about the why. We're here because we want to show up differently. The what, we want to be trauma informed and healing centered. That's what we want to achieve. And John is now going to talk about how do we do that work in becoming trauma informed and healing centered.
Awesome. Hey, Courtney, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here today and to follow up on Courtney's amazing intro. The stuff I'm going to talk about is just like not as cool as hearing Courtney talk. I'm going to be honest, but it is. It's going to be important to be able to build a foundation where we can strategically address the systems that will allow for us to be trauma informed and healing centered. So you've heard me talk about the SHAPE system perhaps in the past. This is one of the tools that we're going to use to look at our system, our comprehensive school mental health system. I'm going to say that, you know, embedded within the SHAPE system, there are a ton of tools that we can use to better understand our environment, our school context, the needs of our kids, our readiness to provide services and supports, the degree to which our environment is trauma sensitive, trauma informed, healing centered. This is really, you know, a much larger platform that allows for us to understand our approach toward an adoption of the national performance measures for comprehensive school mental health. But it nested within the SHAPE system is the trauma responsive schools implementation assessment, something we're going to talk about today quite a bit. I want you to all be prepared to actually like do some work today to log into the SHAPE system. We're going to like give you a little bit of time so you can get an account and start in on actually completing the TRS-IA. We want this to be a useful session that moves the dial on your needs assessment of trauma responsiveness. So just be prepared for that. We're going to jump into it. I'm going to give you a little bit of time during one of the activities. I want to give you a quick tour of the SHAPE system, which requires me to change a little bit of what I'm showing you on the screen. Give me a quick thumbs up if you can see my username. Can you see my password?
We can't. No, your password's hidden, but we see that.
Courtney, you know, you took the air right out of my joke. It's ridiculous. You know, this is where I'm supposed to say, like, don't look at my password. Whatever. It's fine. Moving on. It's going to be okay. We're going to log in. And I want to take a peek at, this is like a demo account that we can take a peek at. I've used this a bunch of times just to show people like what are the components of the SHAPE system. We've got the school mental health profile. If you click on this, it's going to give you a little bit of a sense of like the resources that you have around your district. Maybe it's like, well, you know, who are the students that we serve? What are the data systems that we have? What do we have for staffing? What are the services and supports that we offer? I want to be like fully open and honest. Courtney and Paul, you know, from the Bright program, they have this approach to MTSS mapping that, in my opinion, is going to produce a more nuanced and granular approach to the services and supports this MTSS mapping process. So we can talk about that at some point, especially if you're part of the coaching cohort. You know, I think it's probably going to be something that comes up. But I will say that this is a good starting point if you're interested in getting into kind of MTSS mapping. But the Bright style MTSS mapping piece is something I want you to just be aware of. It's out there. Within the SHAPE system, also, you've got some assessments. You've got this one that we talk about quite a bit, the mental health quality assessment. This is looking at the domains of a comprehensive school mental health system, the national performance measures. So really like, how well am I doing from a teaming standpoint? I can take a look at a report around that. And it goes into great detail around these specific items of a strong comprehensive school mental health team. You're going to be able to understand like, well, what do we mean by multidisciplinary teams? If you take a look at the assessment itself, it has indicators of what that means. So, you know, this is just a quick call out to like, remember that question about multidisciplinary teams? This is how well you did. And you can kind of reflect back on the assessment and see the indicators that lead up to a score like that. So we can look at individual domains. We can look at this summary report, which actually shows like, how are we doing across the whole system? How are we doing, again, with teaming or with needs assessment and resource mapping? So it is a useful process to be able to get a strong sense of what you're doing across your entire system. I'm not going to lie, it's a lot. It's a pretty heavy assessment. And if you're not ready as a team to be able to jump into the entire assessment, you might want to complete one domain of interest. You might want to complete the TRS-IA to start and kind of pause there. You might want to do bright style MTSS mapping and get your feet wet with kind of like what are we offering from like a services standpoint across all tiers of support? What do we have for data systems, infrastructure, teams, people? That might be the place to start. But ultimately, our hope is that you can use the SHAPE system long term to get a really strong sense of the comprehensiveness of your system. So far, does this make sense? You with me? Okay. Other assessments. This is the one we're going to look at, trauma responsiveness. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but these are the domains of a trauma responsive system as measured by the TRS-IA. So we'll get into this a little later. I don't want to spoil the fun for then. I'll show you a couple other resources and then we'll get moving. Resource library, there's a ton of stuff in here across all domains. Like, let's pretend like I need some teaming resources. And I'm hoping that I can maybe take a peek at this like roles and responsibilities templates, all linked in here, all accessible. It's a little overwhelming, not gonna lie, but if you are kind of dialed into a specific domain and looking for resources, this is a good way to filter in on those resources. One other resource I definitely want to show you is the screening and assessment library. I often hear when people are starting in on screening, like, John, I have no idea what to look for. I don't know what measures to use. I'm kind of lost. Okay, well, let's pretend like we need an anxiety measure. It's going to be for screening. I'm going to screen some 12-year-olds. It needs to be in Spanish. Student's going to fill it out. It has to be free. Well, there we go. We've got a bunch of measures, a bunch that we can use and click in on. And ultimately, this is going to give you information about like which versions of the measure are available, what languages does this come in, access to the actual measure itself, screening, scoring and interpretation information. So really, really easy to use, filterable screening and assessment library. Who here didn't know about the screening and assessment library? Quick show of hands. Okay, so this is new for some people. Can people see this this screen? Yeah, I just saw in the chat. Sam, I think it's just you. Sorry, my friend. Everyone else is saying they can see the screen. Okay, so that's the quick and dirty around the SHAPE system. I'm going to get back to the slides so that we can take a peek at some other stuff. Actually, we're going to jump into this. This was our next piece. We're going to, I would like for all of you to at least attempt the process of registering for the SHAPE system at this point. It should not take more than a couple minutes. So I'll drop in the chat the URL that you're going to need to be able to get to this initial starting point, www.theshapesystem.com. And actually, we'll do this together in real time. I'll show you where you need to go. You can go home. Log out for you. So I'm approaching this as though I had never gotten a SHAPE account, and I'm going to sign up. When you get to this screen, it's pretty straightforward. First name, last name, email, role, position. The one thing I want to orient you to, though, here is please log in for district account. We're going to start with a district account. You can always get a school-based account, but to start, it would be good if you started with an overarching view of your system, and then we kind of narrowed it down with different teams. So first, last, email, role, position, district level account. Give me a quick thumbs up when you've hit continue. Thanks, Christina. Kristen, thank you for that. For those of you who are not on video, just give me a yes or no in the chat, or yes in the chat rather. Thanks, Jennifer. Appreciate that. Anthony's rolling, Claire's good, Melanie. Okay, we're good. So this next piece that I want you to be aware of is it's going to ask you a few questions about your system. It's like 7 questions, nothing heavy. No problem, Erin. I'd ask that you kind of rip through these pretty quick. You can always go back and change this, but this is going to help to give the National Center for School Mental Health and really the field a better understanding of kind of what's happening across Massachusetts, across the country. So why don't you go ahead and answer those questions. Then I'm going to show you one more feature of the SHAPE system. Then we're going to move on to the TRS-IA. Kelly asks, we have multiple members from SPS. Is it a problem to all sign up as a district? So ultimately, Kelly, one of you is going to want to pick, one of you is going to want to be kind of like the account holder, but everyone can ultimately have an account. So I think it's going to be okay for you to, like maybe you are the account holder and everyone else for now just sign up as an individual. That's fine.
Yeah, and I was going to add, John, for what it's worth, we've had the folks at the SHAPE system are really good that if it doesn't get quite right the first time, they're really good about helping go back and kind of get everything linked and all of that. So their TA has been pretty good in my experience.
No, that's super helpful, Paul.
John, I have a question.
Go ahead.
My name's Sue. I'm under Kelly Williamson. I'm from Southbridge. I use the link you sent, and am I supposed to be logging in, or are we leaving that just to one person in our district?
For today, if you're here as a team, why don't you pick one person to log in?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And to Paul's point, ultimately, you're all going to want to be on the same account. But I think for today, you can kind of follow along and see what it looks like. Ultimately, the value of having everyone on the same account is that you can aggregate the data and get a really strong sense from your whole team what the lay of the land is in terms of like how far along you are.
Okay, great. I know that there's quite a few of us. I'm pretty black and white. So with Kelly doing what she needs to do, all I need to do is follow along with your screen, and I'll see what I need to see. Is that correct?
All along, you'll be good to go.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Okay, so quick yes or no in the chat. Are we registered? Seeing thumbs up. Yes, yes. Cool. Okay, so we're getting in there. I appreciate that. So now that you're registered, you can access these resources that we just discussed and all these assessments. You are going to be able to add team members to your district account. So, this is, kind of a call out to Kelly Williamson. This is where you would go to ultimately add people to the district level account. So it's good to have kind of a point person within your district that's doing that. It does not take a lot of work. It's like, yep, your name, your email, your title, click send, and there you go. You've got an account. It allows for us to be able to build teams. It's a pretty straightforward process. I will say that, like, yeah, on the front end, there's a little bit of work to do. You kind of have to organize people, but ultimately that allows for us to get a strong sense from the entire team when you administer these assessments. How are we doing relative to mental health quality? How are we doing relative to the trauma responsive schools implementation assessment? Making sure that everyone has access to the resources. So that's why we kind of take the time to navigate this. This is logistical. This is a little bit of just orientation to some of the tools we'll use, but in the long run, it will help quite a bit. Okay, so now that you're all registered, at some point, you're going to be able to sit down with your team and complete the TRS-IA. We'll even go through a little bit of a process together today where we'll march through one of the domains of the TRS-IA. But ultimately, here's a little bit of background around what this measure actually is used for. It supports the generation of a trauma-informed and healing-centered action plan. So when we're looking at kind of the state of our system, the hope is that we can kind of take a look at pieces of that system and see what parts are more trauma informed than others, what pieces of our system need more attention than others, and ultimately generate an action plan that's going to be sensitive to both things that we need to do right now because they're problems, and things that maybe we're doing really well and we want to keep doing them well. So let's invest time and energy into that. It will definitely prompt teams to reflect on the results of the assessment to guide their initial planning efforts. This was designed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and I think and the National Center for School Mental Health. So it is a well-vetted tool and resource that we're hoping is going to guide your work as we get into it. Okay, these are the domains of the TRS-IA. We've got whole school safety planning, we've got whole school prevention planning, we've got whole school trauma programming, classroom strategies, and then we get into a little bit more nuance, prevention and early intervention trauma programming. That feels like a little heavier. Targeted trauma-informed programming. Well, that's decidedly heavier. What about staff self-care? What about family and community engagement? So across all tiers of support and also relative to infrastructure, we've got some stuff going on. This is ultimately the same, these are the same domains I just showed you, but color-coded in a way that helps to kind of paint a picture of where they fall relative to an MTSS triangle. In the green here, I'm going to say that that's mostly pointed at tier 1. Universal, less intense interventions. And I'm going to give the rundown again of kind of like how we conceptualize tiered systems of support. When we think about MTSS and interventions, it's not about grouping. It's about intensity, frequency, dosage, duration. I'm going to give you an example of that. Let's pretend like I meet with a student for 2-3 minutes in a classroom, individually. I process and problem solve a problem that's happening. Is that a tier 3 intervention because it's an individual intervention? What do we think? I'm seeing shaking heads. Who would say, no, John, that's decidedly tier 1. It's brief, it's less intense, it's not taking a lot of energy and effort. I can do that with all kids. Fair? So we've got to conceptualize our tiered interventions relative to intensity. Tier 2 is not group-based intervention. Tier 2 is slightly more intense intervention. It could be individual therapeutic services, short-term. Tier 3, we typically conceptualize as intensive intervention, programmatic, think high intensity, high frequency, high dosage. It's happening for a longer period of time. Bright program, special ed programming for therapeutic services, trauma-informed special education programming, crisis work. That would be tier 3. But at tier 1, we've got whole school stuff happening. We've got curriculum that happens with all kids. And we also have practice-driven approaches. And we're going to talk about those in the next session on February 8th that I hope you can attend. We're going to really unpack the trauma-sensitive classroom strategy guide. And that is a practice-driven approach to really helping students or helping staff to support students in the classroom and create a trauma-sensitive environment. Okay. Tier 2, prevention and early intervention trauma programming. Tier 3, targeted. And then these, I would say, are about human resources available to us in our system. Staff self-care has to be a piece that we orient to. And then we also want to make sure that our community resources are accounted for in our planning. So all that to say, and this requires you to come off mute. So, you know, like orient to that button. Are you surprised by any of this language? Like, is this very, like, is this making you think like, wow, I had no idea that this is what a trauma responsive school would be about? What do you think?
Well, what are you talking about specifically? Like to the words that you're saying, how we're approaching the tier 1 and how we deal with tier 2 and 3?
Are these domains surprising to you? Not really, right?
No, not really.
It's pretty straightforward. We're talking about
Yep.
whole school stuff, tier 1 stuff. We've got some intensive intervention that happens at tiers 2 and 3. We're accounting for staff needs. We're accounting for our community resources. This isn't meant to be something that's wildly different than anything you've done in the past.
It follows the MTSS, you know, right away. You're built right into the tiers, and we're all used to that in so many different domains.
Yeah, Sue, good call out. I mean, I think probably, quick show of hands, who here is familiar with MTSS at this point, in some way, shape, or form? Most people here. Yeah. How about this? Who here has seen a triangle in an education presentation? Yeah, every blessed person. So when we think of MTSS, we outstrip the triangle. It's about that, but it's also about the infrastructure. It's about the teams. It's about the feedback loops and data. It's about screening. It's about using data to inform intervention, progress monitoring, and termination of services, all those things. When you take a look at the domains, and I'll flip back so you can take a peek at them here, what do you think is a relative strength for you right now, for you and your team? Just based on this simple label of these domains. It is 3 o'clock on a Wednesday, short week. You got to stay with me, friends. We're in this for another hour.
Do you want us to just blur it out?
Yeah, Sue, go for it.
You know, right away, whole school safety planning jumps out to me, because we work very, very hard as a school, and also I believe a district, but I can only speak for my school, on safety issues and planning, and the whole school being involved with it, staff and students. So it's definitely something that sticks out. Yeah.
Very cool. Responses in the chat are welcome as well.
John, I think I'm from a big district in New Bedford, and in the last few years, we've revamped our family engagement model. So I think for sure that we have a really dynamic person in charge of that right now, which is what it takes, I think, in a community our size. So that, I think, is a strong piece to our puzzle.
That's really helpful, Kate. I appreciate that. I'm seeing some answers in the chat as well. Strong with classroom strategies, Kristen. Love that. Hannah, I'm new to my school district, but we definitely work on classroom strategies and recently on staff self-care, okay? And community engagement. Matt, you're saying tiers 2 and 3 are covered, but need tier 1 screeners and curriculum. So maybe the top of the triangle, we're feeling like we're stronger than not, but we're really not, we're not taking care of kind of that universal, that prevention oriented response. Okay. Anna, family and community engagement, great. So all this to say, I don't think these concepts are foreign to people, but what we're hoping to be able to do through this experience is to really highlight the ways in which we can take these concepts that are pretty much well understood across schools and put a focus on trauma-informed and healing-centered practice. We have to make sure that the interventions we offer, the approaches that we take, the environments we build are going to be supportive for individuals who've experienced trauma. And let's be honest, it's all of our students have gone through some significant trauma over the past few years. And for some of our students who have been marginalized and who have been historically marginalized and who have had to contend with inequity and racist policy, their trauma is going to be even more significant. Does this make sense to people? Okay, let's keep going. This is a sample domain report that you're going to get when you complete the TRS-IA. I showed you the teaming report from the quality assessment earlier. They look pretty similar. You know, the reports in the shape system are pretty similar looking. But this goes into a little bit more detail around like, well, what do we mean by whole school safety planning? Sue mentioned earlier that she felt like, yeah, my system is doing a pretty good job with whole school safety planning. So I guess like what I would expect to see in Sue's system is that we've got good supervision of students, that we have bullying prevention curriculum and policies and practices in place, that we've got a safe and predictable campus, and that we've adopted a threat assessment strategy so that we can actually like check to make sure that threats have been assessed for likelihood of happening. So I'm thinking like the CSTAG approach, if you're familiar with that, being able to unpack the likelihood that situations will occur. I know for a lot of districts, unfortunately, over the past several years, there's been a heightened sensitivity to threat assessment for threats of, for bomb threats. There's actually been quite a bit of training across Massachusetts and regionally around like, how do we assess the likelihood of a bomb threat being real? And I guess like, didn't really think that that would be a thing that we'd have to like think about all that much in a school setting, but it is. And the same goes for behaviors that are exhibited by students. We have to make sure that our threat assessment approaches are well vetted, evidence-based, and that they're producing a safe environment for our kids. So when I think of these three pieces of the whole school safety planning domain report, you can imagine the kinds of activities that could populate an action plan if you notice that, oh, you know what, our threat assessment strategy is pretty poor. What could we do to improve upon that in the short term? Or maybe we want to look at, well, our adequate supervision is pretty good. What's going well there that we could make sure is scaled up across all of our buildings? So we're not just focusing on the things that need attention right now. We're also focusing on the things that we're doing pretty well and that we want to make sure are going to sustain into the future. So far, does use of a report like this make sense in terms of like how you can get to an action plan or some action plan items? With me? Okay, cool. Same deal with the summary report. It's going to give you this overview of kind of where you fall across all domains and give you a sense of maybe which domain should I start with. This is a report that's pretty kind of like in the middle. I do want to be real with you about these reports from the shape system. It's a pretty high bar. They've set the standard pretty high, and I think it's not uncommon for districts to land in the emerging and progressing benchmarks almost categorically. There's not a ton that I see right out the gate where districts are like, no, we've got mastery across the board. So that's an okay thing. I would rather you be real about where you're at and kind of outstrip that stage of delusion where we think like everything's going well. Let's be real about where we're at so that we can move on to the next step and feel good about the fact that we're leaning into the work in a real way. Okay. So there's a part of me that recognizes that this is a big group. Oh, Alexis, go for it. Kristen, what you got?
It's actually her question. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, you might actually get through this. Typically when we've done the shapes assessments, we've always like formed our team and done it as a team all at once. Mm-hmm. Can you do it where people answer individually and then it compiles all of it, or is it really best to do it as a whole team?
Those are two great approaches, depending on kind of how you want to manage it. I would say both have their benefits. If you've got everyone in the room, let's imagine you're the team in the room right now, and we're all trying to complete a shape assessment. I'm gonna guess that we are going to get mired in the minutia of language pretty quick, and it's gonna take longer to complete. And that's maybe okay. It's an investment in time that you're going to have to make. Now, if you're having people complete it on their own, maybe they'll get through it quicker, but maybe, you know, the collective knowledge of the room doesn't get to inform the answer that we actually make for each question. So benefits to both. I think it's entirely fine if you want to kind of go at this from a whole team standpoint. It's also going to be fine if you are kind of divvying this out to individuals and then convening as a larger team to reflect on the data. Both are possible within the SHAPE system. I think the more important thing is that this is not a one and done activity. You're going to use this information at the outset to gain a little bit of a baseline understanding. And then in the next month, for example, you might actually reflect on the fact that, wow, like we were really hard on ourselves. And as we've gone through this process, I think we actually should have scored ourselves higher. And that's okay. You're learning as you engage in this assessment. The reverse could be true as well. Wow, we really rated ourselves high, but when we dig into our implementation, we're not doing so hot. Either way is fine, as long as you continue to learn throughout the process. Does that make sense? Cool.
Thanks.
So as opposed to actually completing the TRS-IA, because this is a big group, and I'm glad it's a big group. I want to make sure that you're aware of the fact that, like, yeah, this is going to have to be completed by your team in the near future if you're going to use this to guide your action planning. I think each of the teams that are signed up for the coaching cohort are going to be asked to reflect on these data. And that's something that I think will help to compile a good action plan around, like, maybe you're going to start in on trauma sensitive practices at tier 1. Maybe you want to take a look at old school safety planning. So either way, we're going to want to have some data to operate from in order to approach this work from a data informed standpoint. So we won't jump into it, but I do want to call out this current reporting period piece here. If you've ever gone through these assessments in the past, in order to take them again, you have to change the reporting period. So you just kind of click on that and you say, I'm going to report out from September to January on kind of the state of our system from a trauma responsive standpoint. I only mention that because I think it's tripped people up in the past and they're like, well, I already took it, so I can't take it again. No, you can take it again. You just got to change that reporting period. Okay. There is a strategic planning guide that's associated with the SHAPE system. It's one of many strategic planning guides that you can use. It asks some kind of pointed questions around, you know, which domain are you going to focus on, and like what buy-in do you have relative to the specific change you want to make? Do you have resources to make this happen? Are there barriers that you want to navigate? So I wouldn't say it's like it's the be-all end-all, but it's one way to organize your work. If you've got a better process or a better strategic planning guide in your back pocket, totally fine. The more important piece is that you are collectively as a team coming together, reflecting on the needs of your system relative to trauma responsiveness, and that you are deciding together what are the priorities that we want to address in the short term, and prioritizing those items in a way that isn't doing everything all at once. I don't think that we get much accomplished if we try to address every piece of our system all at once. 1 or 2 items, and being sensitive to the thing that Thriving Minds has now championed: shrink the change. Make it a small test of change so that we can ensure that as we take steps forward, we're able to reflect on our implementation. I'm going to use a silly example I use for every blessed presentation. If I try to screen 1,000 kids tomorrow using the PHQ-9, I might forget that question 9 asks about self-harm and suicide. That's going to be a disaster. I might have forgotten to train my staff around how to like respond to those data and like who to prioritize when we're responding to those data. That might be a really damaging experience. 1 kid, 1 measure, 1 day, I could mess that up pretty bad and still be okay. I'm going to learn from the experience. I'm going to move on. I'm going to adjust my practice. So keep the test of change small so that you can react to that implementation and learn from it, and then adapt your practice as you scale it. Let me hit pause. What questions do we have right now? You can type them in the chat. You can come off mute. We would welcome any and all questions about kind of what you've heard so far today.
Sorry, John, I do have a question. It's kind of logistical. About changing the reporting period, we've never been able to change the reporting period. It like says we can't do it in the future.
So you have to actually report out on a past reporting period. So basically it's a point of reflection. So I don't know what happened 3 months from now, but I can report out on what happened 3 months before.
I see. So when we're doing it, because we're reflecting on what we've been doing in the district, it would be like, say, September of last year to September of this year.
There you go. That would be fine.
And then
Yep.
that should go through. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
No, it's a great question. That's a great question. If you got tripped up on that, others will too. Other questions?
I do have kind of a specific question. It may sound kind of silly.
No silly questions here. It's all good.
I am very new to my school district, so I'm very uncertain of what is kind of offered here. I'm over in Sutton. If I start this process online, will it like flag me and be like, hey, this has already been done for you guys before, like, don't waste your energy?
If you start in on the process and try to get an account and it says you already have an account, someone in your district has it, and
Okay.
you might have to do a little digging. You could even
Okay.
like reach out and we can tell you who that person is.
Great.
But I would say any one of you could jump in there, get an account today, and then there's no breaking the shape system. We can back out accounts. We can start you over. You can go through the assessment 9 million times. So there's no, it's not a problem. Even if you got in there just to kind of like practice and take it, that's fine. It's just practice. So yeah, Hannah, I would say like if you feel like you want to get in there and at least try, that's no problem.
Awesome, thank you.
Of course. What else do we have? Okay. How are we feeling? We got about 40 minutes left. Doing okay?
John, there's a question from Jill in the chat. I don't know if you have a specific thought.
Oh, thank you for that, Paul. Jill asks, essentially, what members of the district should be filling this out? That's an awesome question, Jill. So we're asking that, you know, ideally, you're putting together a team that's multidisciplinary. So you maybe have some building level administration, you might have a district level administrator, you might have some school mental health practitioners, so maybe school counselor, school adjustment counselor, school psych, social worker. You might want to have a teacher or two on the team. You might want to have a nurse on the team. So a nice broad representation of the staff in your district so that you can answer these questions in a way that's going to pull on the expertise of everyone. Now, that's not going to be possible for every single team. So if you kind of have to start with a smaller set of individuals and then recruit some people onto your team over time and then retake the TRS-IA, that's okay. In fact, a lot of times what I recommend people do to start is basically saying like, hey, Jill, you're the lead for your district right now. Take the whole blessed assessment, get used to it, dig into the questions, get familiar with what these questions are asking so that when you take it as a team, you can answer those questions and you don't get so bogged down in the language. You get to prepare a little bit more for what that experience is going to look like and pre-correct some of the stuff that you know will come up. Because I think that sometimes if we go into these assessments without any understanding of the language or the specific things that will be asked, we can get bogged down pretty quick and turn a 30, 40 minute process into 2 hours in no time. Yeah. Okay. So keep going. All right. We're going to hit this very quickly, but this speaks to this idea of shrinking the change. Okay. When we are approaching implementation, so let me back it up. We've got our team assembled. We've gone through the TRS-IA. We've reflected on some priority items we want to address. Those have been formed an action plan that we all are satisfied with and that we agree upon. Now we're going to do the thing. We're going to actually undertake some efforts to implement a specific practice or piece of a system. This is where we want you to shrink the change for sure and consider this approach of continuous quality improvement practices. So the idea of a plan, do, study, act cycle is that it's going to allow for you to explicitly lay out the steps that are going to be taken to enact that change that you're hoping to make. You're going to define the objective. You're going to ask some questions of your implementation, like, what do I expect is going to happen? What do I think is going to happen if I do this in the way that I've intended? What data am I going to collect to help me understand what happened? You're then going to carry out that plan and collect those data that you identified, and you're going to study it. You're going to analyze that. How well did that go? Did it match my predictions? Did I get the outcomes I was hoping for? Was I able to accomplish this test of change well? What barriers existed? What problems came up as a function of my implementation? What do I need to do differently next time? And if I scaled this up, what would I need to do differently if this was not just one kid I was screening, for example, but 20 kids or 50 kids or 1,000 kids? So it keeps us honest about our implementation. It keeps our tests of change smaller to start and then scaling up over time as we adjust our practice based on all the stuff that we're learning. Last step, we act. Am I going to abandon this practice because it was terrible and it's not a thing I want to pursue? Am I going to adapt, which is typically what happens? I liked that, but you know what? I don't like that measure that I used, or I don't like that practice that I used. I'm going to shift that a little bit. I don't like how I implemented that, but I like the thing I'm trying to do. I'm going to shift that a little bit. Once we adapt, we try it out again. And if we're going to adopt it, we're essentially saying, great, that went really well. I think this is ready for scale up, and we slightly scale up the change. And it looks something like this: iterative cycles of PDSAs, that lead to large scale implementation in a way that avoids this idea of complete and total disaster. If you've got a small change that you're trying to make, the size of your test is maybe 1 kid, 2 kids, 1 classroom, then that's where you kind of want to start. You also want to reflect on, like, well, what's the thing I'm trying to do? If I mess this up, what's the consequence of a failed test? The last thing you want to do is have a large scale test of change with a high consequence of failure. And I've seen this happen with things like, again, maybe screening or piloting and evidence-based practice. Let's pretend like tomorrow I decide, you know what, we want to run groups in our district. We're gonna start 12 CBT groups tomorrow across 10 different schools, and we're just gonna see how that goes. And no one knows how to access the resources. We didn't get consent for any of the kids. Parents are upset because we've got 12 times 8 kids who are enrolled in a service that maybe they didn't approve. None of our providers were trained effectively. So like the test of change was horrible. We could have ultimately avoided that if we shrunk the change and maybe said, well, instead of like starting a group tomorrow, let's actually like unpack the components of group and see what we already have for expertise and resources. That's going to be our first scale test of change. Do we even have the things appropriate to run group? Could we find a time that's appropriate to run group? Do we have the staff that are bought into the process? So like shrink it down so that you can assess, analyze, and make some decisions. Otherwise, it could go really sideways. And what happens then is we end up throwing out good practices because we think it's a bad practice. If we screen 1,000 kids tomorrow and it goes terribly, we might decide collectively that, wow, screening is terrible, when really your implementation of the good thing that is screening was terrible. The implementation was the thing that went sideways. The screening practice is still a good thing, but we've clouded that because of our implementation. Does that make sense to people? So if you feel like you're going too far too fast, if it's too much, then we're going to ask you to kind of back down the implementation. Go slower, think smaller, think quality over quantity. Cool? Okay. So I invite Paul, Courtney, I invite Amanda, I invite all of you to jump in. We want to have a quick discussion with you that is going to kind of tee us up for a discussion about disproportionality for the rest of our session. And I really appreciate what Courtney put together here for these questions. When we think about the TRS-IA results, they can provide a glimpse at the gaps in our system's trauma responsiveness that we're going to want to address so that we can make sure all of our students have appropriate levels of care. But I want to see if we can maybe tease out a little about this. When we consider the following questions and when we consider what we want to do from a trauma responsive standpoint, what students and families will have an easier or a more difficult time accessing services? Is there any sense in the room about, when we talk about services for trauma, do you have a sense of, from your community, which students are going to have a harder time accessing those services and why? What do we got?
Students with families that have transportation issues.
Okay, Anna, thank you for that. Great.
33. Financial issues.
Okay.
I work in a very rural community, so we're at least like 35 minutes from supportive services.
Cultural beliefs, what does the families culturally believe is helpful or not helpful?
Yeah, true. Well played.
I mean, I guess what I want to normalize about this conversation is a little bit back to something that both John and Courtney had shared earlier, that we live in a country where there are all these structural inequities, right? Where, and in particular, that's really founded on structural racism. And so it's natural and normal that there are going to be inequities in our schools. And it's really our responsibility to identify those and where they're coming from. And in some ways, I love the shape system because it gives us a frame. And at the same time, it doesn't necessarily in itself point us towards saying there are going to be inequities that we need to address, sort of like when we think about this. So often when I'm having this conversation with the schools and district teams that I'm lucky to coach, I think the conversation we're trying to have is to say, every school, every district is going to have matters of structural inequities, is going to have sets of kids and families that are marginalized, that are not as well or as easily served or supported by what that school and that district has to offer. And our job is to really honestly identify those and have an honest conversation about it. And I think to the degree that we're saying, no, we're good, kind of everybody has equal access in our school, we're actually probably doing a disservice. And so I think this is the point where we want to kind of like lovingly nudge ourselves toward thinking, for whom are the supports and interventions that we do have available not working well? And how do we really center those kids, those families, maybe even those staff members as we plan going forward? So just really want to invite folks to kind of take a deep breath and really, think now, let's put our equity lenses on and look at this conversation from that perspective.
Super appreciate that, Paul. Thoughts and comments about this idea of structural racism, policies and practices that drive inequity. I think it's also probably a point where we have to call out that this is a place that you can be honest and open. This is a place where we're not going to ultimately call anyone out in terms of like, if you've got a problem that you're hoping to contend with and that you are looking for some feedback around, want to make sure that you have space to share that.
In Southbridge, this is my third year here, And we're very lucky that we are pairing with City Connects and the social work system. And I feel like that has really helped us be able to brand out more into the community. And I think that listening to what Paul said, absolutely, it rings very true. And I think that we're very lucky and celebrate to have the City Connects. And I think they're going to be very helpful in this implementation as well.
I'm curious what folks, again, think about this. And again, the notion, I don't mean to be overly pushy, but in some ways, the notion that if we're not proactively identifying inequities and working on them, then we're in fact living with inequity. And I'm just curious again, how that lands with folks and kind of what it looks like in your own schools and districts.
I was messing with my audio, so I missed the beginning of it, but boy, that rings true because we understand the families that don't have those resources, and we say, if only they could, and we don't take that next step. I think was that Paul speaking? Really valid point. And that happens, I'm a counselor, and it happens when we do outpatient therapy, when we try to get them to go into the office. And so we do have City Connects allows for some transportation they can set up through their voodoo that they work in the community. Yeah, so there's a lot of, we can identify those inequities, but how do we take that next step? Great point.
I was just going to piggyback on that. I don't know. I was just going to say, like, so in my community, in my district, it's a very like white, affluent kind of district. And I think that we lose sight, or the district lose sight of all of the different cultural pieces. And it's just kind of very focused on certain aspects. And I think that we could do better in so many ways in terms of like looking at the marginalized groupings and trying to be able to kind of address all of it in honest and open ways in order to be able to service everybody, as opposed to, like you're saying, the loudest or the most prevalent, the parents that show up more or that say I need or my kid needs. I think that's really hard to do when kids, families aren't able to, or don't, for the cultural reasons, they don't stand up or loud for what their kid's dealing with, I guess. I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to figure out how we can do it in a way that's helpful and supportive.
I really appreciate that, Alexis. I think it's making me remember when we were leading PD some during the height of the pandemic, we were thinking about this notion that if we think about a tent and who's like in the middle and then who's at the edges of the tent, how do we make sure that the tent covers everyone? And we're thinking it's the idea of like putting the people who are furthest from equity at the center of our planning, because if we get it right for the people who are furthest from equity, then we're most likely to get it right for everybody. But if we have the so-called imaginary typical child in our district, which often means the more privileged child or family, and then we're trying to stretch the tent to the margins, like that's just, much harder. So again, it's why I think you're going to hear us kind of repeatedly kind of surfacing this question of like, who are we really imagining as the children and families in our district that we're planning for, and that we're doing this work for, as we go forward.
The other thing I just want to add and lend my voice to Paul, everything that you were saying, is that the idea that you have to understand a community can't thrive from drained individuals. A family can't thrive from drained individuals. And so what are we doing to recognize that we're not trying to make individuals whose propensity to lean in toward healing and resources is already low, that we're not requiring more of them to reach out and get it because they're already drained. How do we even approach it from the mindset that they're already drained? They're already in crisis or they're already surviving. And so am I expecting thriving behavior from individuals that are just trying to go from day to day?
Amanda, I appreciate your comment in the chat. Within our district physical space, staffing, class size, resource allocation, the PTO in one part of the district may have no funds to support enrichment, where wealthy part of the town has thousands to spend on student and teacher enrichment resources.
I did also like Alexis's point about students for whom maybe their families aren't well knowledged or not really, you know, whether it's the not having the energy or like she'd mentioned being extremely drained and not seeking out those services that as service delivery providers we're seeing might be needed. And it just makes me think back to the fact that we are the greatest, sometimes the greatest advocates for those students. And like those few students who do come to mind for something like this are those exact cases of families who might not be interested or want to put in the energy to seek out things. And at the end of the day, that those are the kiddos who really need the help.
I was gonna say in my district, I think another piece of it is fear because there are so many limited services up here. That oftentimes if, you know, the school is the only place where kids are visible in the community. We have multi-generational families that live on plots of land that they might go to the grocery store once a month, or even if they're not going there, they're going to the local church to pick up their food. It's a town of like 2,000. So it's worrisome for them to engage in services because they don't know what to expect, and their parents never did, and their parents never did. So it's, yeah, nerve-wracking for them.
And actually, I just was gonna say one other thing. Sorry, I feel like I'm monopolizing things, but I also am thinking about like kids or the students that we have that are like in the LGBTQ plus community who maybe aren't in a place where they can be open and honest about what's going on, or their families are in a position where they absolutely are not supportive and are not going to be able to meet them where they're at. And I think that silent community can be ignored unintentionally in ways that can be hugely detrimental in terms of their needs and creating a sensitive environment, a healing environment for them, because they aren't even able to voice kind of what their, you know, concern or fear or trauma or history or needs are. And their families, they aren't even willing to be able to talk with their own families about it. So their families can't speak up or get what they need. I was just going to say that piece.
Appreciate all these comments. I guess if I'm gonna, there's a thread that runs through a lot of this that I want to just call out in that teaming came up earlier. And I think one of the things we have to be really cognizant of is who are the individuals in our community that need to be represented on those teams? Who are the individuals for whom we need to make the effort to include their voice, their perspective? Because otherwise, you know, when we think of all the stuff we want to do, we're going to do it from the perspective of what we know how to do and not from the perspective of what we need to do for everybody else that needs us to understand their perspective. So, so with that, I guess thank you for the amazing perspectives, and we're hoping that this is the kind of conversation we can foster as we go through these sessions. We're closing in pretty close to time. We're gonna offer just a little bit more in terms of like how can we ultimately take a step toward this idea of equity within school mental health, within our trauma responsive environment. I think we have to like start with some questions about whether equity is a problem. It is. We just need to own that. In every community, every single school and district has some degree of equity that's occurring. And I think if we can accept that and operate from that, from ownership of that issue, then excellent. Like that's at least a starting point. The why of equity is going to be probably the hardest thing in my mind, because that requires for us to not only call out, you know, the disproportionality that exists, but then we have to do the self-reflection and take a hard look at our system and practice and teams and policies and procedures and say, what is driving inequity in our district? What have we essentially memorialized that's causing inequity, and start to dismantle that. I guess, you know, I do appreciate this slide. I want to say that this is either, this is a slide that we used last year. This idea that like data is going to be the starting point for all of this work. Data is going to be the thing that we use to uncover what's going on, monitor what occurs as we start to make change within our system and our policies and procedures. But we have to do the work beyond data collection. You have to actually do something with the data. And that's the hard work, but I think we're going to start today with a little bit of discussion around that. Like, well, how do you even get to disproportionality? What data do I even look at so that I can understand this problem a little bit better? This is a really complex topic. We're talking about disproportionality being driven by things like family and community, being by discipline policies and practices, by educational opportunity. It's the confluence of a lot of different things that we have to be aware of. And I think that's what makes it so complex when we try to get at the why. Because this wouldn't be hard work if it was simply a matter of calculating what percent of disproportionality existed and then like clicking the button to say like, well, we don't want that to happen anymore. Something is occurring within our system to drive that disproportionality, and likely it's embedded within a structure that's been persisting for a long time. And that means it's going to require some significant effort to change, but that change must occur. I like this definition. For those of you that don't throw around the word disproportionality all day long, it's this idea of it's a group's representation in a particular category that exceeds expectations for that group or differs substantially from the representation of others in that category. I think one that will resonate with people is there is disproportionality, because we've heard this in the news, we've heard this in educational circles, disproportionality around the degree to which we suspend our students of color. That occurs at a disproportionate rate, more than it should, based on the representation of our students of color in our community. What is driving that suspension rate? What is driving the decisions to suspend students of color at an increased rate? That's what we have to get at. As an example, one of the things that we have to get at. At the risk of, I don't know that we have a tremendous amount of time to jump into all of these next pieces. You will get the full slide deck for sure that you can peruse to be able to kind of get at the nuts and bolts of calculating disproportionality. But these are some examples of disproportion or categories that we could uncover some disproportionality. So I just mentioned suspensions. but we're going to see disproportionality with chronic absenteeism. And we have to figure out, like, well, why is that? Why is it that this group of individual students is disproportionately absent compared to this other group of students? Why do some students drop? Why is the dropout rate for one category of students different compared to another? Matriculation rate for four-year post-secondary institutions, mental health screening participation rate. So each of the data elements that we have that we look at, it's not just about the aggregate, it's about the disproportionality between groups that we have to be aware of. I'm going to call out one of these things here, enrollment in mental health services. Let's pretend like our enrollment in mental health services is really, really good in our district. We're like the vast majority of students, 85 to 90% of students that want to enroll in services, enroll in services. I love that. That's wonderful. We can't just look at that aggregate number and be excited. We have to look at, well, what percentage of students for whom English is not their first language access services, and compare that to the aggregate? We might see that, oh, only 20% of students who are English language learners access services. I can't be excited about that aggregate number without accounting for the disproportionality for the different groups we serve. Let me hit pause. Does this idea of disproportionality make sense to people? Is this resonating? Okay. We're going to skip that. We're going to skip that. And we're going to skip that because it's basically just more examples of data and data collection systems that you can take a peek at. I will call out this piece. Who here is familiar, by a quick show of hands, with the DESE district profiles? A few of you. For those of you that aren't aware of this, this is open access. You can take a look at this all day long if you want. And it's going to actually, it shows you some of the disproportionality that you report out as a district. So you can take a look at the graduation rate by race, ethnicity. You can take a look at graduation rate by gender. You can look at the dropout rate with the same kinds of parameters. So if you're looking for a place to start, DESE's done some good work with your data system such that you can already take a look at this stuff. I'll tell you this much though, if you're going to look at things like psychosocial data, it's not going to be here. You're going to have to look at local data sets for that, because that simply does not exist at the state level at this point. Oh, that's good to know, Paul. I have not done the comparison with other states, but I'm psyched to hear that we're moving in the right direction in Massachusetts. Quickly, with the time that we have remaining, we just want to make sure that you know how to calculate disproportionality well. So there are a few examples that are kind of nested within here that I think will help you to understand. For example, like, let's pretend like I screen a bunch of kids tomorrow, and I want to understand the degree to which there is disproportionality between students who are Hispanic, who engage in the screening process, and white students who engage in the screening process. And if those numbers are different compared to what I would expect to see in the population, then I got to ask some questions about that. So let's pretend like, and I'll use my district as an example. We've got about 50% of the kids in Methuen that identify as Hispanic. Okay, so when I screen 1,000 kids tomorrow, I would expect that about 50% would be Hispanic. Otherwise, there's disproportionality relative to the number of students who engaged in screening and the number of students that didn't. So these are going to drive conversations. These data, they're going to drive questions. This is the easy part. Calculating disproportionality is rather simple. It's a quick math problem. The hard part of calculating disproportionality is what comes after. Well, why is it that students who identify as Hispanic in my community are not engaging in the screening process with the same regularity as I would expect? I don't know. That's where the heavy lifting goes. And in a lot of ways, we want to share that we're not always going to have the answers for you here as we go through these PD sessions. This is really heavy lifting for your community to engage in. We want to give you the tools. We want to give you the perspective around the importance of these things. We want to give you resources to do this well, but unpacking why something is occurring that is causing disproportionality, inequity, that is the work, the heavy work that districts need to engage in and lean into. And we'll support you as best we can, but we also don't have a magic wand to wave to dismantle structural racist policy or to create a better understanding for the why of disproportionality in your district. Does that make some sense to people? Okay. There are some examples in here. I'm going to let you take a peek at these on your own so that we can kind of close out with a little bit of just reflection and questions around this topic of, yeah, let me actually even stop sharing. Want to get a sense of where people are at from the standpoint of, we've talked about a lot today. Courtney led us with some amazing discussion about, trauma, understanding what it is, how it affects our students, leading into this understanding of like the how are we going to support our students? We talked about the SHAPE system. We talked about the TRS-IA. We got into some discussion around inequity and calculating disproportionality. We did all that in an hour and a half. So where are you at now relative to these topics? What questions do you have? What reflections do you have about the next steps you want to take with your teams? What do we think?
So in Southbridge, we're at 6 different schools right now. Some of the people here, and I'm like, I missed the first session. I was out sick, so I missed the first session. I apologize. I guess I'm wondering how we as a district are going to come together to just start looking at and taking some of these, doing some of the first steps in SHAPE. And how are we going to do it? I mean, we need an action plan for getting together to do it. That's where my brain is at. How do we get started?
And then I just want to piggyback on what Sue said, because I'm the clinical coordinator at Southbridge Academy, which is a therapeutic day program within the Southbridge district. And so although we implement similar practices for the district, we are also a little different too. And so I guess I'm sitting here wondering, well, how does that work? Do I work with my school adjustment counselors as a little sub team and then, bring that to the, as a district conversation? Like, I'm not clear about that part of it.
I just want to say thanks both to Sue and Anna and to the Southbridge folks for showing up so powerfully today. And as Sarah noted in the chat, actually from Thriving Minds, both Sarah and I have been assigned to kind of co-coach and work with you all. And so we'll be meeting with Kelly within a few days and to kind of do some pre-planning and then to come back and think, how can there be assessments at both the district, but then the individual school level? What are themes that go across schools in the district? So that might be like district level projects. What might be priorities for each school that we could sort of support you with? And so just really, really excited that Southbridge signed up to be part of this coaching cohort and also is getting the DESE grant. So to sort of like have some resources to bring to this work.
That's great. Thank you, Paul.
I just wanted to lift up this discussion today. This work, as John and Paul and others have said, it's not easy. When you start to really look at being trauma informed and move to healing centered, you start to uncover more and more information, and some of it really isn't pretty. And so, the main thing is you can always change direction, but the important thing is to just start small, start with what's most tangible, start with the biggest champions perhaps that you have, and start there. And don't get discouraged if you come up with a lot of emerging scores on your TRS-IA, for example. That's par for the course. It's just it's heroic work to do this stuff, and it's not easy. And the main thing is to just get started and start at a place that just feels most doable.
Final comments from our participants here today. Next steps we're hoping to take. Oh, Hannah, I thought you were coming back on to give us some words of wisdom.
I wish I had some. I actually just had yet another question. If we do have anything, if I log off and I think to myself, well, gosh darn it, I wish I had asked that, who would be best to direct that email to?
I mean, the Thriving Minds team is here for you. You could email me, Paul, Courtney, Amanda,
Okay.
to try and get a sense of what's next. And we hope to see you on February 8th, which is our next session, which will focus on Tier 1 practices. We're going to unpack the Trauma Sensitive Classroom Strategy Guide. So with this last minute left, I guess I want to just invite everyone to reflect a little bit on what you went through today. This was a logistics heavy session where we talked about the infrastructure, or I guess the needs assessment and resource mapping processes that you're going to undertake. Data heavy kind of session. Next is going to be practices. We want to get into the Tier 1 things that we can do to start supporting our kids. So just thrilled that you're here today. Thank you so much. Paul, Courtney, any last thoughts?
Just really grateful, excited to continue the work going forward.
Okay. Well, we are here for you, my friends. Until next time, be safe. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And we're really grateful that you showed up today and in droves. So have a wonderful end to the day, and we'll talk soon.